The summer of 1988 began like any other at Clearwater Lake in northern Michigan. The cottonwood trees whispered secrets along the shoreline, their leaves catching the golden light that danced across the water's surface. Families arrived in wood-paneled station wagons, coolers packed with ice and dreams of perfect summer days. Children's laughter echoed across the pristine lake, mixing with the distant hum of outboard motors and the gentle lapping of waves against weathered docks. But this particular summer would end differently. By August, 7 children would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would haunt a community for decades. The Whitmore family reunion had been a tradition for over 20 years. Every July, relatives would converge on the sprawling lakeside property that patriarch Edmund Whitmore had purchased in 19. The 40-acre compound featured a main lodge, several smaller cabins, and nearly a quarter-mile of private shoreline. It was the kind of place where memories were made and family bonds were strengthened, where city children could run wild and taste freedom under the vast Michigan sky. Edmund's children had grown up spending their summers here, and now his grandchildren carried on the tradition. The cousins, ranging in age from 8 to 15, formed their own pack each year, creating adventures that would sustain them through the long months until the next reunion. This year, 7 cousins had made the journey to Clearwater Lake. 15-year-old Amanda Whitmore was the unofficial leader of the group, tall for her age with sandy blonde hair that she wore in intricate braids. Amanda possessed the kind of natural confidence that drew others to her. She was the daughter of Edmund's eldest son, David, who ran a successful accounting firm in Grand Rapids. Amanda had just finished her sophomore year of high school and was already making plans for college, much to her grandfather's pride. She was responsible, mature beyond her years, and the adults trusted her to watch over the younger cousins. 14-year-old twins, Jessica and Jennifer Caldwell, brought an infectious energy to every gathering. The daughters of Edmund's only daughter, Catherine. They lived in Chicago with their mother, who worked as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The twins were mirror images physically, both with dark curly hair and bright green eyes, but their personalities couldn't have been more different. Jessica was outgoing and adventurous, always the first to suggest cliff jumping or midnight swims. Jennifer was more cautious, preferring to read mystery novels on the dock or collect shells along the shore. Despite their differences, they shared an almost telepathic connection that fascinated and sometimes unnerved the adults. 12-year-old Michael Whitmore was David's youngest son and Amanda's little brother. He worshipped his sister and followed her everywhere, desperate to keep up with the older kids. Michael was small for his age, but made up for it with determination and an unexpected fearlessness. He could stay underwater longer than anyone else and was the best swimmer in the family, spending hours each day practicing his strokes in the lake's crystal clear water. 10-year-old Rebecca Ashford was the daughter of Edmund's second son, Thomas, who worked as a high school principal in Detroit. Rebecca was quiet and observant, with thick framed glasses and a habit of documenting everything in a small notebook she carried everywhere. She took photographs with her new Kodak disposable camera and wrote detailed entries about each day's activities. Rebecca had an almost photographic memory and often surprised adults by recalling conversations and events with startling accuracy. 9-year-old Christopher Manning was the son of Edmund's youngest child, Robert, who had married into money and now lived a comfortable life in Ann Arbor. Christopher was the joker of the group, always playing pranks and making the others laugh with his impressions of their parents and grandparents. He had a mischievous glint in his brown eyes and an ability to talk his way out of trouble that both charmed and exasperated the adults. The youngest of the 7 was 8-year-old Emily Whitmore, David's daughter from his second marriage. Emily was the baby of the extended family and was treated with special care by everyone. She had inherited her mother's delicate features and her father's stubborn streak. Despite being the smallest, Emily refused to be left behind and often surprised everyone with her courage and determination. The 1988 reunion began on July 15th, just as it had every year before. The adults fell into familiar routines. The men gathered on the deck to discuss business and politics, while drinking beer from bottles that sweated in the humid air, while the women prepared elaborate meals in the lodge's spacious kitchen, their conversations flowing between gossip, child-rearing advice, and memories of summers past. The children, as always, formed their own little world. During the first week, everything proceeded normally. The cousins swam and fished, explored the wooded trails that crisscrossed the property, and played elaborate games of hide-and-seek that could last for hours. They built forts in the woods using fallen branches and old tarps, created treasure maps of the shoreline, and spent long evenings catching fireflies in mason jars. Amanda took her role as the eldest seriously, making sure everyone wore sunscreen, that the younger children stayed close to shore when swimming, and that no one wandered too far into the woods alone. She carried a whistle that her father had given her, which she could blow to summon the group if anyone got separated. The twins, Jessica and Jennifer, spent their time in typical fashion, Jessica organizing fishing expeditions and swimming races, while Jennifer preferred to sit in the shade reading Nancy Drew mysteries and working on crossword puzzles she'd brought from home. Michael shadowed Amanda constantly, eager to prove he was mature enough to be included in the older kids' activities. Rebecca documented everything, filling her notebook with observations about the wildlife, the weather, and her cousin's daily adventures. Christopher kept everyone entertained with his constant stream of jokes and his uncanny ability to mimic their grandfather's gruff voice. Little Emily tagged along with determination, refusing to be excluded from any activity. The adults noticed nothing unusual during those first 2 weeks. The children appeared at mealtimes hungry and sunburned, full of stories about their daily adventures. They complained good-naturedly about mosquito bites and poison ivy, begged for ice cream money for the small store down the road, and fell asleep each night exhausted from their activities. But beneath the surface of this idyllic scene, something was stirring. It began with small things, conversations that stopped when adults approached, secretive glances exchanged between the cousins, and what appeared to be some kind of ongoing discussion that the children kept among themselves. The adults initially dismissed it as typical childhood behavior. Kids always had their secrets, their private games, and inside jokes that excluded the grown-up world. Rebecca, with her keen eye for detail, was the first to notice that something was different about the property this year. In her notebook, she recorded observations that would later prove significant. New tire tracks in areas where vehicles rarely went, the discovery of cigarette butts in the woods, far from where any adult would venture, and what appeared to be evidence of a campfire in a clearing that the family never used. She mentioned these findings to Amanda, who initially dismissed them as probably belonging to teenagers from town, who might have used the property during the off-season. But Rebecca persisted, and gradually the other cousins became aware of the signs. The children began to notice other things too. Christopher, while exploring near the old boathouse, found candy wrappers that weren't from brands they recognized. Michael, during one of his long swims, thought he saw someone watching from the tree line across the lake. But when he pointed it out to the others, there was no one there. Jessica and Jennifer whispered together about strange sounds they'd heard at night, not the usual night sounds of the forest, but what sounded like voices carrying across the water. As July drew to a close, the cousins' behavior began to change in ways that the adults couldn't quite put their finger on. They stayed closer to the lodge during the day and seemed reluctant to venture far into the woods. They asked more questions about the property's boundaries and about who else might have access to the area. When pressed for explanations, they would exchange glances and claim they were just curious. The adults, caught up in their own vacation routines and the pleasure of extended family time, didn't pay close attention to these subtle shifts. They were dealing with their own dramas. David was going through a difficult divorce. Catherine was considering a job change. Thomas was worried about budget cuts at his school, and Robert was in the midst of some kind of business dispute. The children's apparent closeness and their ability to entertain themselves was seen as a blessing rather than a cause for concern. Edmund Whitmore, now 73 and dealing with the early stages of what would later be diagnosed as Parkinson's disease, spent most of his time in his favorite chair on the lodge's wraparound porch, watching his family with satisfaction. He had built something lasting here, a place where his descendants could connect with each other and with the natural world that had shaped his own character. The sight of his grandchildren playing together filled him with deep contentment. But even Edmund, with his decades of experience reading people and situations, sensed that something was off. The children seemed different this year, more secretive, more nervous. When he asked Amanda about it directly, she assured him that everything was fine, but he noticed that she couldn't quite meet his eyes when she said it. The first week of August brought a change in the weather. The clear, sunny days gave way to a pattern of afternoon thunderstorms that would roll across the lake with dramatic intensity. The humidity increased, making everyone irritable and uncomfortable. The children spent more time indoors, playing board games and watching movies on the lodge's old television that could only pick up 3 channels when the antenna was positioned just right. It was during this period of forced indoor time that the adults began to notice the children's behavior more closely. They seemed to be constantly whispering among themselves, and their conversations would stop abruptly whenever an adult entered the room. When asked what they were discussing, they would give vague answers about games or plans for when the weather cleared. Rebecca's notebook entries from this period, which would later be discovered and analyzed by investigators, showed an increasing level of concern about the watchers in the woods. She wrote about feeling like they were being observed, about finding fresh footprints near their favorite swimming spot, and about a growing sense that they were no longer alone on the property. The other cousins later confirmed through their parents that Rebecca had shared these concerns with them. Amanda had initially tried to calm the younger children's fears, suggesting that Rebecca was letting her imagination run wild. But even Amanda began to notice things that made her uncomfortable: shadows that seemed to move when they shouldn't, the feeling of being watched, and an overall sense of unease that she couldn't shake. On August 8th, the weather finally cleared, bringing one of those perfect late summer days that made everyone remember why they loved the lake so much. The air was clear and cool, the humidity had broken, and the water sparkled like diamonds under the brilliant blue sky. It seemed like the perfect day for the children to return to their outdoor adventures. The adults made plans for an elaborate barbecue dinner, with Edmund's famous ribs and Catherine's potato salad. The children asked if they could spend the day exploring the far end of the property, an area they rarely visited because it required a longer hike through the woods. They promised to be back by 4 o'clock to help with dinner preparations. Amanda packed a cooler with sandwiches and drinks. Rebecca loaded her camera with fresh film, and Christopher filled his pockets with the candy he'd been saving. The twins decided to bring fishing gear in case they found a good spot along the shore, and Michael packed his swimming goggles in hopes of finding a new place to practice his underwater skills. Little Emily brought her favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear named Miss Buttons, that went everywhere with her. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the 7 cousins set off into the woods, following a trail that would take them to the remote northern section of the property. They were in high spirits, excited to have a full day of adventure ahead of them. The adults watched them disappear into the tree line, Amanda's bright yellow t-shirt visible until the forest swallowed them up. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. When 4 o'clock came and went with no sign of the children, the adults initially weren't concerned. Kids lost track of time, and the far end of the property was a long walk away. But by 5 o'clock, worry began to set in. By 6 o'clock, the men had organized a search party. David Whitmore took the lead, his accounting mind immediately organizing the adults into systematic search teams. They divided the property into sections and began calling the children's names, their voices echoing through the darkening woods. They followed the trail the children had taken that morning, finding evidence of their passage footprints in the soft earth, a candy wrapper that Christopher had dropped, marks where someone had broken branches to mark their path. The trail led them nearly 2 miles into the woods, to a clearing that overlooked a narrow inlet of the lake. It was a beautiful spot, secluded and peaceful, exactly the kind of place that would appeal to children looking for adventure. But the children weren't there. What they found instead sent chills through every adult present. The cooler Amanda had packed sat open beside the remains of a hastily abandoned picnic. Sandwiches were still wrapped in plastic, but drinks had been spilled and were soaking into the ground. Rebecca's notebook lay open to a page covered with writing, but the words were smeared and illegible. Christopher's candy was scattered across the clearing as if it had been dropped in haste. Most disturbing of all, Emily's teddy bear sat propped against a tree, staring out at the lake with its button eyes. But there were no children. No signs of a struggle. No indication of where they might have gone. The search continued through the night, with every adult scouring the woods and shoreline. They called until their voices were hoarse, used flashlights to peer into every shadow, and checked every possible hiding place they could imagine. Local authorities were notified, and by dawn, state police and volunteer searchers had joined the effort. The initial investigation focused on the possibility that the children had simply gotten lost. The woods around Clearwater Lake were vast, and it would be easy for even experienced hikers to become disoriented. Search teams with dogs were brought in, helicopters flew overhead, scanning the forest canopy, and divers began searching the lake's depths. But as the hours turned into days with no trace of the 7 cousins, the focus of the investigation began to shift. This was no ordinary case of lost children. The scene in the clearing suggested that something had interrupted their picnic, something that had caused them to abandon their belongings and disappear. The FBI was called in on August 12th, 4 days after the children vanished. Special Agent Patricia Donnelly, a specialist in missing persons cases involving children, took charge of the investigation. Her team treated the clearing as a crime scene, carefully documenting and collecting every piece of evidence. What they found painted a disturbing picture. In addition to the abandoned picnic, there were signs that others had been in the area recently. Cigarette butts were found in the underbrush, along with footprints that didn't match any of the children's shoes. Most concerning of all, there were tire tracks leading to an old logging road that connected to the main highway several miles away. The investigation expanded rapidly. Every person who had access to the property was interviewed. Background checks were run on all the seasonal workers who maintained the grounds. The few neighbors within miles of the lake were questioned extensively. Local law enforcement agencies were asked to be on the lookout for 7 children traveling together. But despite the massive effort, no credible leads emerged. The children had simply vanished without a trace, as completely as if they had been swallowed by the earth itself. The Whitmore family remained at the lake property for weeks, refusing to leave while their children were still missing. The lodge became a command center for the search effort, with maps covering every surface and volunteers organizing search schedules around the clock. The adults barely slept, surviving on coffee and determination, clinging to the hope that at any moment, their children would emerge from the woods with some reasonable explanation for their absence. But as August faded into September, and the search teams began to scale back their efforts, the horrible reality began to sink in. The 7 cousins were gone, and nobody knew why or how or where they had been taken. The case that would become known as the Clearwater Lake disappearances had begun, and it would haunt the community for decades to come. The FBI kept the case open, following up on leads as they came in, but as the months and years passed, those leads became fewer and less credible. The Whitmore family property was sold in 1991. None of the surviving family members could bear to return to the place where their children had vanished. The new owners, unaware of the property's dark history, enjoyed several peaceful summers before learning about the disappearances from local residents. The case files grew dusty in storage. The FBI agents moved on to other assignments. The community slowly, reluctantly, began to heal from the tragedy. But the questions remained unanswered and haunting. What had happened to 7 children on that beautiful August morning? Where had they gone, and why had they left no trace behind? For 36 years, those questions would remain unanswered. The Clearwater Lake disappearances would become one of Michigan's most famous unsolved mysteries, the subject of documentaries, books, and countless internet forums, where amateur detectives would endlessly debate theories and possibilities. But in the summer of 2024, 36 years after 7 children vanished without a trace, a team of underwater salvage divers working in the deepest part of Clearwater Lake would make a discovery that would finally begin to provide answers to the questions that had haunted so many people for so long. What they found in the murky depths of the lake would prove that the truth about the Clearwater Lake disappearances was far stranger and more disturbing than anyone had ever imagined. The morning of June 15, 2024, dawned gray and misty over Clearwater Lake. The water lay smooth as glass, reflecting the heavy clouds that promised rain before noon. For the 5-man crew of Great Lakes Marine Recovery, it was just another job, a routine salvage operation to retrieve a sunken pontoon boat that had gone down during a storm the previous autumn. Captain Jake Morrison had been working these waters for over 15 years. His team specialized in underwater recovery operations throughout northern Michigan, from simple boat retrievals to more complex environmental cleanup projects. They'd seen it all: cars that had slipped through thin ice, construction equipment that had fallen from barges, even the occasional aircraft that had made an emergency landing and sunk in the lake's depths. But nothing had prepared them for what they would find in the deepest part of Clearwater Lake. The crew consisted of Morrison and 4 experienced divers: Tony Vasquez, a former Navy SEAL who now worked commercial diving; Beth Crawford, a marine archaeologist who often consulted on underwater recovery projects; Danny Park, a young but skilled technical diver; and Luis Santos, who operated the surface support equipment and underwater cameras. Their target was a 24-foot pontoon boat that insurance records indicated had sunk in approximately 60 feet of water near the center of the lake. The owner had given up hope of recovery after the initial search efforts had failed to locate the vessel. Now, 6 months later, the insurance company had hired Great Lakes Marine Recovery to find and retrieve whatever remained. Morrison's boat, the Northern Star, was equipped with the latest in sonar technology and underwater imaging equipment. As they approached the estimated location of the sunken pontoon, Santos activated the side-scan sonar, its electronic pulses penetrating the lake's murky depths to create detailed images of the bottom. What appeared on their screens defied explanation. The sonar showed not one sunken vessel, but what appeared to be an entire underwater graveyard of objects scattered across the lake floor. Cars, trucks, boats, and other unidentifiable shapes lay scattered in a rough circle, as if they had been deliberately placed there over many years. "Jesus Christ," Morrison muttered, staring at the sonar display. "What the hell is all this?" Crawford leaned over his shoulder, her trained eye interpreting the images. "Those are definitely vehicles. Look here, this one's a school bus. And this looks like it might be a van or RV." Vasquez, who had seen his share of underwater mysteries during his military service, felt an immediate sense of unease. "Captain, these aren't accident sites. This is too organized, too deliberate. Someone's been dumping vehicles in this lake for years." The team spent the next hour conducting a comprehensive sonar survey of the area. What they discovered sent chills through even these experienced professionals. The underwater debris field covered nearly 3 acres of lake bottom, with vehicles ranging from what appeared to be 1970s-era cars to more recent model trucks and SUVs. Most disturbing of all, many of the vehicles appeared to be intact, as if they had been driven or pushed into the lake rather than accidentally submerged. Morrison made the decision to call the authorities before proceeding with any diving operations. Within hours, the lake was crawling with law enforcement officials from multiple agencies. Detective Lieutenant Maria Gonzalez of the Michigan State Police took charge of the scene, coordinating with FBI specialists and underwater recovery experts. The first dive was conducted by Vasquez and Crawford, both wearing full-face masks equipped with underwater cameras to document everything they encountered. As they descended through the thermocline into the lake's cold, dark depths, their lights began to illuminate the ghostly shapes below. The sight that greeted them was unlike anything either had ever seen. More than 24 vehicles lay scattered across the lake floor like toys discarded by a giant child. School buses, delivery trucks, passenger cars, and even what appeared to be a small motorhome sat in various states of decay, their metal shells providing homes for fish and aquatic plants. Zebra mussels had colonized every surface, creating an alien landscape of otherworldly beauty and horror. But it was when Crawford's light played across the rear window of a partially buried 1987 Chevrolet van that the true horror of their discovery became apparent. Through the algae-covered glass, she could make out shapes inside the vehicle, shapes that were unmistakably human. The recovery operation that followed would take nearly 3 months and involved dozens of specialists from multiple agencies. Each vehicle had to be carefully photographed and documented before being raised to the surface. What emerged from Clearwater Lake painted a picture of systematic disposal that had been going on for decades. The vehicles contained the remains of 43 people, ranging in age from young children to elderly adults. Many showed evidence of trauma that indicated they had not died from drowning. The forensic evidence suggested a pattern of deliberate killings followed by elaborate disposal in the lake's depths. But it was the recovery of a particular vehicle that would finally provide answers about the Clearwater Lake disappearances of on August 23, 2024, almost exactly 36 years after the 7 cousins had vanished. Divers brought up a heavily deteriorated 1986 Ford Econoline van from a depth of 75 feet. The van had been weighted down with concrete blocks and chains, ensuring it would stay on the bottom indefinitely. Inside, forensic specialists discovered the skeletal remains of 7 individuals whose ages and physical characteristics matched the missing Whitmore children. Also recovered from the van were personal items that left no doubt about the victims' identities. Amanda's whistle still on its lanyard around the neck bones that had once belonged to a 15-year-old girl. Michael's swimming goggles trapped in the van's rear compartment. Rebecca's distinctive thick-framed glasses, and most heartbreakingly, Emily's teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, his fur long since rotted away but his button eyes still staring sightlessly in the eternal darkness. The discovery sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the community alike. The Clearwater Lake disappearances, Michigan's most famous unsolved mystery, were no longer unsolved, but the answers only raised more disturbing questions about who had killed 7 innocent children and why their bodies had ended up in an underwater vehicle graveyard that seemed to represent decades of systematic murder. FBI Special Agent Catherine Walsh, who had taken over the cold case in 2019, found herself at the center of what was rapidly becoming one of the largest serial killer investigations in Great Lakes history. The forensic evidence suggested that the lake dumping operation had been active from at least the early 1970s through the mid-1990s, representing a killing spree that had claimed dozens of victims over more than 2 decades. But even more disturbing was the realization that the perpetrator or perpetrators had operated with virtual impunity for years, disposing of evidence in a location so remote and deep that it might never have been discovered if not for a routine insurance salvage operation. The investigation that followed would uncover a web of corruption, conspiracy, and calculated evil that reached into the highest levels of local law enforcement and government. As forensic specialists worked to identify the other victims found in the underwater graveyard, a pattern began to emerge that suggested the killings were not random acts of violence, but part of a larger, more sinister operation. Many of the victims appeared to be transients, runaways, or people who wouldn't be immediately missed, the kind of vulnerable individuals that predators often target. But the presence of the Whitmore children, who came from a prominent local family and whose disappearance had generated massive publicity, suggested that something had gone wrong with the usual pattern. Phone records from 1988, preserved in archives and finally examined with modern investigative techniques, revealed a disturbing series of calls made from the Clearwater Lake area in the days leading up to the children's disappearance. The calls had been placed to a number registered to a property management company that upon closer investigation turned out to be a front organization with connections to organized crime figures operating throughout the Great Lakes region. Even more chilling was the discovery of Edmund Whitmore's business records, which had been stored in a Detroit warehouse since his death in. Among his papers, investigators found evidence of significant gambling debts and connections to loan sharks who had been pressuring him for payment in the months before his grandchildren's disappearance. The emerging picture suggested that the Whitmore children had not been random victims, but had been taken as leverage in a debt collection scheme that had gone horribly wrong. When Edmund couldn't or wouldn't pay what he owed, his beloved grandchildren had paid the ultimate price. But who had been behind the operation? And how had they managed to dispose of evidence so effectively for so many years? The answer would come from an unexpected source, a dying confession from a man named Vernon Ellis, a former mechanic who had worked at a small garage near Clearwater Lake throughout the 1980s. Ellis, facing terminal cancer and apparently seeking to clear his conscience before death, contacted the FBI in September 2024 with information about the lake dumping operation. According to Ellis, the garage where he worked had been a front for a much larger operation run by a man known only as the Cleaner. This individual, whose real name Ellis claimed never to have learned, specialized in making problems disappear for organized crime figures throughout the Midwest. Bodies, vehicles, evidence of various crimes, anything that needed to vanish permanently could be handled by the Cleaner's operation. The process was chillingly efficient. Victims would be killed elsewhere, then brought to the garage where their bodies would be loaded into stolen or purchased vehicles. The vehicles would then be weighted down and driven into the lake during the pre-dawn hours, when no one was around to witness the disposal. The remote location and extreme depth of Clearwater Lake made it the perfect dumping ground. Ellis claimed that he had been forced to participate in the operation under threat of death, helping to prepare vehicles for disposal and occasionally serving as a lookout during dumping operations. He described a network of corrupt officials who ensured that investigations were stalled or misdirected, and who provided advance warning of any law enforcement activity in the area. According to Ellis, the operation had been run with military-like precision and had disposed of evidence for dozens of crimes over more than 20 years. The Whitmore children, he claimed, had been grabbed not for ransom but as a message to their grandfather about the consequences of failing to pay his debts. But Ellis's most shocking revelation concerned the identity of the Cleaner himself. According to the dying man, the mastermind behind the lake dumping operation had been someone with intimate knowledge of the area, someone who had legitimate reasons to be on the property at all hours of the day and night, someone who had been above suspicion because of his position in the community. The Cleaner, Ellis claimed, had been a respected member of law enforcement, a sheriff's deputy, who had used his badge and authority to commit and cover up crimes for over 2 decades. Deputy Sheriff Frank Kowalski had worked for the county sheriff's department for 31 years before retiring in 1999. His personnel file showed an exemplary record of service, with commendations for bravery and community service. He had been one of the first responders to the Whitmore family's call for help in 1988 and had participated in the initial search efforts for the missing children. But Ellis's allegations painted a very different picture of Kowalski's activities. According to the dying mechanic, the deputy had used his law enforcement connections to identify vulnerable victims, his knowledge of the area to select disposal sites, and his authority to misdirect investigations and cover up evidence. The revelation that a law enforcement officer might have been responsible for the Clearwater Lake killings sent shockwaves through the investigation. FBI agents began a comprehensive review of every case Kowalski had been involved with during his 3 decades of service, looking for patterns that might support Ellis's claims. What they found was a trail of suspicious deaths, missing persons cases that had been poorly investigated, and evidence that had mysteriously disappeared from storage. In case after case, Kowalski had been present at key moments, always offering logical explanations for why investigations had stalled or failed to produce results. But Kowalski himself was beyond the reach of justice. He had died of a heart attack in 2003, taking whatever secrets he possessed to his grave. His family, shocked by the allegations, cooperated fully with investigators, but claimed to have no knowledge of any criminal activities. The investigation expanded to include a review of all law enforcement personnel who had worked with Kowalski over the years. Several retired officers came forward with information about suspicious behavior they had witnessed, but had been afraid to report at the time. A picture emerged of a man who had used his badge to commit unspeakable crimes while maintaining a facade of respectability and community service. As autumn turned to winter in 2024, the investigation continued to uncover new evidence and identify more victims. DNA analysis of the remains found in the lake revealed connections to missing persons cases from across the Midwest, suggesting that the operation had been even larger than initially suspected. But even as investigators worked to build cases against any surviving conspirators and to bring closure to the families of victims, one crucial question remained unanswered. Where was the evidence that would prove conclusively that Frank Kowalski had been Polina? The answer would come from the most unlikely source imaginable, a discovery that would shake the investigation to its core and reveal that the truth about the Clearwater Lake disappearances was even more disturbing than anyone had imagined. In Rebecca Ashford's notebook, the one that had been found in the clearing where the children had vanished, investigators had always assumed that the water-damaged pages contained nothing but illegible smears. But modern forensic techniques, including infrared photography and chemical analysis, would finally reveal what the observant 10-year-old had written in her final hours. And what she had written would change everything. The FBI's Quantico Forensic Laboratory had seen countless pieces of evidence pass through its doors, but Rebecca Ashford's notebook presented a unique challenge. The water-damaged pages had been dismissed for 36 years as containing nothing but illegible smears and deteriorated paper. But in December 2024, armed with advanced infrared spectroscopy and chemical enhancement techniques that hadn't existed in 1988, forensic document examiner Dr. Sarah Chen began the painstaking process of revealing what the 10-year-old girl had written in her final hours. The process took weeks. Each page had to be carefully separated, digitally photographed under multiple light spectrums, and subjected to chemical treatments that could reveal traces of ink invisible to the naked eye. Chen worked methodically through the notebook, page by page, slowly bringing Rebecca's words back from the grave. What emerged from those water-stained pages would shatter everything investigators thought they knew about the Clearwater Lake disappearances. Rebecca's entries from the days leading up to August 8, 1988, revealed a level of observation and detail that was remarkable for a child her age. She had documented not just the strange signs the cousins had been finding around the property, but had made connections that even trained investigators had missed. July 28th, found more cigarette butts by the old boat dock. Same brand as the ones Chris found yesterday. Marlboro Red. Daddy smokes those, but he's been trying to quit and Mom won't let him smoke them at the lake. These are fresh. Someone's been watching us. July 30th, saw tire tracks again by the logging road. Big truck, maybe a pickup. Amanda says, I'm being silly, but I measured them with my ruler. They are 11 inches wide and have a weird tread pattern with little squares. I drew a picture. August 1st, the man in the uniform came by again today. He talked to Grandpa for a long time on the porch. Grandpa looked scared after he left. When I asked Grandpa who he was, he said just a friend, but his hands were shaking when he poured his coffee. Grandpa's hands never shake. August 3rd, I think the man in the uniform has been watching us. Jessica saw someone by the tree line when we were swimming yesterday. She thought it was a bear, but bears don't wear hats. I'm going to ask Daddy about it, but I don't want to scare the little kids. August 5th, Grandpa had another visitor last night. I couldn't sleep because of the thunder, so I went to get a glass of water. I saw headlights in the driveway and heard voices on the porch. One of them was the uniform man again. They were arguing about money. Grandpa kept saying he needed more time. The other man said time was up. I hid behind the kitchen door until they left. August 6th. I'm really scared now. Amanda doesn't believe me, but I know someone's been in our cabin. My camera was moved and some of my pictures are missing. The ones I took of the tire tracks and the cigarette butts. Someone took them while we were at dinner. I'm going to hide this notebook somewhere safe. August 7th. Tomorrow we are going to the north end of the property. Amanda planned it, but I think it was the uniform man's idea. He talked to her today by the dock. He seemed really nice and asked lots of questions about where we like to explore. He said there were neat old buildings up there we should check out. But something felt wrong about it. The way he smiled didn't match his eyes. I'm going to bring my camera and document everything. Dr. Chen's hands trembled as she read the final entry, written in Rebecca's careful handwriting on the morning of August 8th, early morning. Can't sleep. Keep thinking about the uniformed man. I remembered where I saw him before. He was one of the policemen who came when Mrs. Henderson's car went in the ditch last summer. His name tag said Deputy Kowalski. Why would a policeman be asking Grandpa for money? Why would he be so interested in where we play? I think we are in danger. If something happens to us, I want someone to know that the policeman with the tire tracks was here, the one who made Grandpa scared. His truck has the square tread pattern and he smokes Marlboro Reds. He knows where we are going today, because we told him. Amanda thinks he's nice, but I think he wants to hurt us. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm hiding this notebook just in case. If someone finds it, please pill us. Please find out what happened to us. The policeman did it. The final page contained something even more chilling, a detailed drawing of tire tread patterns and a rough sketch of a man in a sheriff's deputy uniform, complete with badge number and name tag. Rebecca had documented everything with the precision of a trained investigator, creating a record that would have solved the case immediately if it had been readable in. FBI Special Agent Catherine Walsh stared at the enhanced pages spread across the conference table, feeling a mixture of admiration for Rebecca's courage and fury at the injustice that had been allowed to continue for so long. Here was proof that a 10-year-old girl had identified her killer and the danger to her family, but her warnings had been silenced by water damage and technological limitations. The tire tread pattern Rebecca had drawn was immediately recognizable to investigators who had been building their case against Frank Kowalski. It matched perfectly with impressions taken from crime scenes throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, impressions that had been dismissed at the time as belonging to law enforcement vehicles that had legitimate reasons to be present. Even more damning was Rebecca's documentation of Kowalski's interactions with Edmund Whitmore in the days before the children's disappearance. Her notebook entries painted a clear picture of a debt collection scheme that had escalated to kidnapping and murder when the old man couldn't pay what he owed. Armed with this new evidence, investigators were able to piece together the final days of the 7 cousins with heartbreaking clarity. Kowalski had been pressuring Edmund for months, using his position as a law enforcement officer to make threats that couldn't be reported without revealing the old man's gambling debts. When Edmund continued to stall on payment, Kowalski had decided to send a message that would be impossible to ignore. The deputy's plan had been simple and cruel. He would take Edmund's beloved grandchildren, hold them long enough to terrify the old man into compliance, and then dispose of them to ensure there were no witnesses. He had used his badge to gain the children's trust, his knowledge of the property to select an isolated location, and his connections within the criminal network to arrange for disposal of the evidence. But Rebecca's keen observations had documented every step of the process, creating a record that would ultimately bring justice decades after her death. The investigation into Frank Kowalski's crimes expanded rapidly once Rebecca's notebook provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. Bank records from the 1980s and 1990s showed suspicious cash deposits that coincided with known disappearances. Phone records revealed a network of contacts throughout the Midwest who had been involved in various aspects of the disposal operation. Property records showed that Kowalski had purchased several remote parcels of land that were later found to contain burial sites for victims who hadn't been dumped in the lake. Most shocking of all was the discovery that Kowalski hadn't worked alone. The underwater graveyard at Clearwater Lake had been too large and too sophisticated for one person to manage. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a conspiracy that involved multiple law enforcement officers, local officials, and organized crime figures. 3 other retired law enforcement officers were arrested in connection with the case, charged with conspiracy, murder, and civil rights violations. 2 local businessmen who had provided vehicles and equipment for the disposal operations were also taken into custody. The investigation revealed a network of corruption that had operated with impunity for decades, protected by badges and the assumption that law enforcement officers were above suspicion. The trials that followed would captivate the nation. For the first time in decades, there was hope for justice for the victims of the Clearwater Lake killings. Rebecca's notebook became the prosecution's star evidence, her childish handwriting and careful observations providing testimony from beyond the grave that no defense attorney could effectively challenge. The surviving conspirators were convicted on multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. Most received life sentences without the possibility of parole. The trials also revealed the full scope of the operation, with evidence linking the group to more than 60 deaths over a 25-year period. But for the families of the Whitmore children, no amount of justice could bring back what they had lost. The 7 cousins who had set out for adventure on that August morning in 1988 were finally laid to rest in 2025, nearly 37 years after their disappearance. Their funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including many who had participated in the original search efforts. Edmund Whitmore's surviving children spoke at the service about the courage their nephews and nieces had shown, particularly Rebecca, whose observations had finally brought their killers to justice. Amanda's whistle was buried with her, a symbol of the leadership role she had tried so hard to fulfill. Michael's swimming goggles were placed with his remains, representing his love for the water that had ultimately claimed his life. Emily's beloved teddy bear, Miss Buttons, was restored as much as possible and buried with the 8-year-old who had carried him everywhere. The Clearwater Lake property, site of so much tragedy, was eventually donated to the state and turned into a memorial park. A granite monument near the shore bears the names of all 63 victims identified in connection with the case, with the 7 Whitmore children listed first in recognition of Rebecca's role in solving the mystery. But the case had repercussions that extended far beyond criminal convictions and memorial services. The revelation that law enforcement officers had been responsible for decades of systematic murder led to comprehensive reforms in how missing persons cases were investigated. New protocols were established to prevent conflicts of interest and ensure that cases involving potential law enforcement corruption were handled by outside agencies. The underwater recovery operation at Clearwater Lake continued for months, yielding evidence that helped solve dozens of cold cases throughout the Midwest. Families who had waited decades for answers about missing loved ones finally received the closure they had long sought. The lake, once a symbol of summer fun and family memories, became a testament to the persistence of those seeking justice and the power of truth to eventually prevail. Dr. Chen's work on Rebecca's notebook led to the development of new forensic techniques for recovering information from water-damaged documents. Her methods would go on to help solve other cold cases where crucial evidence had been dismissed as unreadable. Rebecca's legacy lived on not just in the justice her observations had made possible, but in the advancement of forensic science itself. The Clearwater Lake case also highlighted the importance of listening to children and taking their concerns seriously. Rebecca's observations had been dismissed by adults as childish imagination, when in fact she had been conducting a more thorough investigation than the trained professionals who would later take over the case. Her notebook became required reading at the FBI Academy, a reminder that important evidence can come from the most unexpected sources. As the legal proceedings wound down and the media attention faded, the community around Clearwater Lake slowly began to heal from the trauma that had haunted it for nearly 4 decades. The truth had finally been revealed, justice had been served, and the victims had been laid to rest with dignity. But late at night, when the wind blows across the lake's dark surface, locals still speak in hushed tones about the 7 cousins who had trusted the wrong person and paid the ultimate price. They remember Amanda's leadership, Jessica and Jennifer's inseparable bond, Michael's determination, Rebecca's keen observations, Christopher's infectious laughter, and little Emily's boundless courage. The case files are closed now, the evidence catalogued and stored away. The boats that once carried dive teams have been replaced by recreational fishermen and tourists who come to see the memorial park. The lake has returned to its peaceful appearance, giving no hint of the horrors it once concealed. But in the depths of Clearwater Lake, where the sun's rays never penetrate and the water remains cold and dark year-round, the scars remain. The locations where vehicles once lay marked on the bottom are slowly being reclaimed by nature. But those who know the lake's history can still see the patterns in the sediment, the subtle depressions where evidence of evil once rested. The Clearwater Lake disappearances had finally been solved, but the questions they raised about trust, authority, and the vulnerability of innocence would linger long after the last news story had been filed and the final court session had ended. In the end, it was a 10-year-old girl's courage and keen eye for detail that had brought justice to 63 victims and exposed a conspiracy that had operated in plain sight for decades. Rebecca Ashford's notebook, preserved by chance and revealed by technology, had become one of the most important pieces of evidence in American criminal history. Her words, written in careful cursive on the morning she died, would stand as an eternal testament to the power of observation, the importance of speaking truth to power, and the ultimate triumph of justice over evil, no matter how long it takes to prevail. The 7 cousins of Clearwater Lake were finally at peace, their story told, their killers brought to justice, and their memory preserved forever in the hearts of those who had never stopped believing that someday, somehow, the truth would finally come to light.